moments for folks to come into the room. So before we get started on the film screening of Bad Hombres, I want to introduce our panelists who are each gonna just do a brief introduction of themselves before we get the film started. So I'm just gonna turn over to Carlos Sandoval first. Carlos.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Carlos Sandoval. I'm a documentary filmmaker, also a writer, and a lapsed and recovering lawyer. So I'm very excited about being here today.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. Jimmy Aliaga. I am currently the regional president for the New York region of the Hispanic National Bar Association. Very excited to work on these issues. Before that, I was a law enforcement accountability prosecutor, prosecuting NYPD officers for misconduct on and off the job. And before that, I was a juvenile offender and spent 2 years on probation in Virginia. I'm very excited about this screening, and it's been apparent to me that a lot of Hispanic folk in the legal community, prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys don't have the historical context. And I applaud Carlos and Jorge for this project because it really does give us a good picture about it. So excited to rewatch it.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jorge. I am the National Criminal Justice Director at Latino Justice Pro-Left. And yeah, it's a strange sense of things come around, right? I'll be 13 years out of prison in July, right? And I'm on parole for another 29 for a robbery committed in 1992, for which I spent 17 years in prison. And having come to this position, to having met people who create policy, who enact policy, who enforce policy, right, was something that I thought about when I was in a cage. And I thought about, why aren't our voices being heard? Why is it only people who are wearing white coats? Why is it academics who are talking about what works and what doesn't work? And I never really saw it in the context of my experience, which my experience was a Chicano experience, was growing up in Texas in the fields, right? And it's just about seeing people like Carlos get together and put this film together, and being on these panels like today. I want to commend UCLA and y'all and DPA for putting this together. Seeing all these friends I have here, all these comrades, all these people who have come together to talk about the Latinx experience and how we're going to hopefully find a way to together find not just a way to reform the system, but a way to totally transform it, do away with it, and get to something else. So yeah, it's good to be here.
Thank you, each of you, for that grounding for today's discussion. I just want everyone to notice that there is also a side chat, so we will have time for a short discussion after this, but because it's so important to engage deeply with this material, some of it might be very striking, some of it might be new. It would be really great if we can have a side conversation in the chat as well. Folks can feel free to respond to what you see in the film, and we can have a conversation there. And then when we come back, we'll be able to have a conversation with Jimmy, Carlos, and Jorge. So thank you.
My father was gunned down by Bakersfield PD, 73-year-old suffering from dementia, early stages of dementia. He probably wasn't even doing anything, just taking his walk so he can try to rest. I ain't got nothing against the police, but this needs to stop against innocent people. Enough is enough already.
Look at your hand! Look at your hand! We have a 311 shots fired! Shots fired!
Ruben! Policia! Manos!
Oh, no.
Manos!
Hey. Drop the gun! Drop the gun! Do it now! Drop the gun!
Luis, are you okay? You are 5 men. 5 men. Papa, is he okay? He doesn't move.
Ven para acá. Va, ven acá. Ma!
Colonialization, racial dominance, the notion that there is a superior race in the United States has everything to do with control of a particular population.
When it comes to the criminal justice system, Latino stereotypes tend to focus on certain types of criminality. And these are long-standing historical narratives that have been created since at least the mid-1800s. Mexicans, Latin Americans generally, were looked at as an inferior race. That helped justify the conquest of half of Mexico by 1848. It certainly was part of what the United States designs on expanding westward were all about.
When the U.S.-Mexican War ended in 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, one of the key provisions was that Mexicans living on now United States side would be able to choose U.S. citizenship if they wished, and then to have their property rights maintained. But no matter what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said, many whites believed that they had won the war and Mexicans no longer had any claim or right to California. So they felt completely justified in posting notices that said all Mexicans, all Latinos, Chileans, Peruvians, any other Spanish speakers in the mines have 24 hours to leave, and if they didn't, they would be killed.
Anglo-Americans wanted access to Mexicans and indigenous peoples' land, and one of the principal ways to do that was to eliminate them, either by outright killings or by criminalizing them and making them outsiders in a community that they had long before actually dominated.
In the middle of the 19th century, Mexicans who were extra-legally killed by lynch mobs or Texas Rangers or vigilantes, it's certainly in the thousands. One of the things that led to the Mexican lynchings being forgotten is that they divided the victims into just two categories, black and white. And in that white category were Native Americans, Chinese, and more than anyone else, Mexicans.
Making one group of humans to be separate and apart and lesser than is a project of racialization.
Spanish-American War, which resulted in the acquisition of a handful of territories within the Caribbean Sea and also in the Pacific Islands. Puerto Rico especially became a target for this acquisition.
Puerto Ricans are second largest population in the United States today of Latinos, and that's a population that has been under U.S. domination since 1898.
Many Puerto Ricans, by way of United States policies and economic policies that the United States fostered and promoted, migrated out of Puerto Rico into the 50 states. And they migrated here under incredible hard conditions. I'm a Puerto Rican man in the United States. I was picked up by the police twice. I remembered what it felt like having my nephew watch me being stopped for no justification. Damn it, I had shorts on, sneakers, tank top, a basketball under my arm. I had just eaten bacalao. Do you know what bacalao is? Bacalao is like pungent with onions, and they claimed I was smoking pot on a street corner. That's why they stopped me. The stereotypes, the profiling, really like the excessive policing that exists in urban America exists in so many ways, and the devastation stayed with me forever.
Puerto Ricans have this distinct experience of being colonized by the United States and also citizens of the United States, where immigration is not as central to their experience in being here. And thinking about other Latin Americans that are coming to the United States, where immigration is the issue that they face the most. Those two distinct identities really shapes people's experiences. And I think part of that is what we're seeing and how it's shaping the larger narrative within the United States, that there's this idea that criminal justice is not as central to the Latinx experience, which is unequivocally false, right? Because part of the way that immigration comes into place largely is through criminalization.
During the 1920s, Mexicans made more than 1 million border crossings into the United States. The Mexican population of the United States by 1930 was about 10% of the entire population of Mexico, about 1.5 million people. The National Origins Act of 1924. It's effectively a whites-only immigration law that restricts about 96% of the open quota slots to Europeans. But there's employers across the western United States who are saying, we need access to Mexican workers. If you prohibit Mexican workers from coming into the country, what are we going to do with our farms? What are we going to do with our railroads? Who's going to take care of our children? All of that. So they build in an exemption that Mexicans can come and go, enter and exit the country, largely at will. But what starts happening during the 1920s is that it's not that Mexicans are coming and going out of the country, it's that they're settling down in the United States and they're becoming Mexican Americans. And this creates a new crisis for the white settler state. We never intended for Mexican immigrants to stay. We intended them to come, pick, and go. So they do come to one compromise, is the Immigration Act of 1929. This was a law that was created to target Mexican immigrants in particular, to make sure that they went through the official ports of entry and got permission to come into the country, so that permission could be revoked at any time. We didn't want to have so many Mexicans here. And if they cross the border unmonitored, they're going to be criminalized. They're going to be turned into felons. Immediately after the passage of this new law, the number of Mexicans being imprisoned in the United States began to skyrocket. By the end of the 1930s, about 44,000 Mexicans had been arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. This was the first surge of Mexican incarceration in the United States and had everything to do with immigration control. And here in the United States, incarceration is one of the leading, strongest pillars of the settler state. It functions to remove people from the land, to cage them up, and in fact, to eliminate them from the social order.
We have something like 2.3 million people incarcerated in cages in the U.S. I want people to understand that when you put someone in jail or prison, you put them in a cage. A cage is made of iron, it rusts, it's made of steel, it clangs, and that's what we do to animals. Part of that is taking away the simple freedoms, keeping your hair the way you want it, not having any personal expression when it comes to facial hair or hair, having them all wear the same clothes, making them stand a certain way when they address a guard, right, your hands behind your back, always adopting a subservient pose. Prison is long, long periods of lonely despair, interspersed or broken up by maybe small seconds of terror. What it is you get dehumanized. It's just a constant wearing down of the individual. You end up questioning yourself, telling yourself, I deserve this. I am the piece of shit that they're telling me I am. And that ends up transferring itself to whatever interactions you have when you get out. And you have to constantly fight that. I was born in the Panhandle of Texas. My father was a farmer. My childhood was a normal Chicano Mexican-American childhood, right? Living in the fields with my family, working la cosecha, going to school, fighting with the white folks, that kind of stuff. Until I turned about 15 or 16, then things kind of changed. One of the things that I just started admitting to the last few years, I wondered what set me on this path, was the fact that before I went to prison the first time, I was thrown in jail for drinking while DWI, back when it was legal, actually, driving while drinking. And I mouthed off to the cop, and I was thrown into a county jail, into a tank full of men, grown men who'd been convicted and were waiting to go to prison as opposed to city jail. I was raped pretty brutally all night. They let me go the next day, and 2 weeks later, I walked into a fast food joint and robbed it in this Odyssey prison. It took me a long time to come to terms with that.
The country's insatiable appetite to continue to punish people is also a form of social control. And social control exists for multiple reasons, not the least of which is to marginalize people, not the least of which is to actually control their behavior.
In 1855, California enacted what is called the Greaser Act. This law was a way of racially profiling Mexicans, people of Latin American origin, in ways that allowed law enforcement to control that population.
Racial profiling itself is inherently reflective of what people's perceptions are of Latinos in general.
Hollywood films pushed this idea that Latinos were a criminally prone population. This idea of the bandido, the criminal Mexican, was also part of the narrative that these people who were resisting and in their own communities were trying to maintain their own land and territory and property, that these were criminal elements. Very similar to how Native Americans were looked at as fierce savages.
What Hollywood's done is to reduce an entire culture to one thing: criminality.
In the city of Los Angeles, by the 1940s, young Mexican-American wore zoot suits. There was a way of trying to find their own sense of self and identity at a time when they were marginalized in a city that was once part of Mexico. And it was difficult for them to even walk downtown into white neighborhoods, white areas of town.
People choose to dress in distinctive ways because it's a countercultural movement. It's to show that they're no longer invisible. When kids themselves feel like they have no self-identity in the community because it's stigmatized, it's demonized, they're gonna still wear it as a form of rebellion. Because if society doesn't care about them, they're not gonna compromise their identity to make them happy. They're not. They're already marginal themselves. They don't even have to wear clothes. Their colors of their skins, their haircuts, their walk, their nonverbal communication, all these cues are also gonna be used against them as them being gang members.
In many ways, that trajectory between bandidos and that stereotype vagrancy laws that happened in California. The way the entire Zoot Suit riots actually occurred as a way to protect the community from abuse from, in that case, naval forces who are on leave. All these issues feed into a bigger stereotype of criminality among all of us.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Right after Nixon declares the first iteration of the war on drugs,
with the signing of this
in
bill,
New York, Nelson Rockefeller created these mandatory minimums for drug possession, the Rockefeller drug laws, which carried 12 to life sentences for simple drug possession.
The new law is tough. There will be no reduced or suspended sentences, and persons serving less than a life term will get no parole.
People don't realize that when we talk about drugs and we talk about drug wars, they've always been targeted against people that were not white.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Fast forward 30 years later, we're seeing 30, 40, 45,000 arrests every year. One year, there were more people that got arrested for marijuana possession in 2010, 2011 than could fit in all of Yankee Stadium. 86% Black and Latino.
The studies are showing, and have been showing consistently over time, that Latinos use illicit drugs and other substances at much lower rates than whites in the United States.
We can go back and forth about drug laws if they're neutral. We cannot deny that drug enforcement is never neutral and is based on disrupting and controlling communities of color.
The war on drugs, it's a war on Latinas, Latinos, it's a war on people of color, it's a war on immigrants. But we cannot divorce what's happening in the United States, what's happening in the entire hemisphere. The war on drugs in the United States is also a war on our gente in Central America. On our pueblos of Sudamérica, and our people and incredible towns throughout the Caribbean.
Entre 2006 y 2017 murieron 330,000 personas en México por la guerra contra la droga. Colombia es el rey de la cocaína.
Think about places like Colombia and Mexico and seeing the ridiculously high death tolls associated with drug-related violence. The conversation that is missing is the United States export of drug prohibition and how that has created all this violence, which has influenced the forced migration patterns out of Latin America into the United States.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
There is a long-standing myth that immigrants come into this country to commit crime. But the data over time show that immigrants actually tend to have lower rates of incarceration, lower rates of crime than other groups and U.S.-born citizens.
We know that when you look at the statistics, the research, it shows that people of color are more likely going to be targeted to go into prison. We already know that's the design. That's a fact. I've been pulled over by the police at my university. They look at my embodiment. They look at my presentation of self. They look at my tattoos. They look at the way I dress. And I could have a PhD, a JD, or MD. As long as I look like I do, I'm still going to be called a gang member. And And it's funny because when you ask me where I'm from, like, I'll tell you exactly where I'm from. What you're asking me, what gang I'm from? Well, let me answer that. You see those buildings over there? I hang out with 3 or more people. We all coexist in a department. It's called the Department of Sociology. So by definition, yeah, I am a gang member.
The country views all people in the same way with that quick association of stereotype, that almost like Pavlovian response. You see a Mexicano, he's got to be in a gang. You see a Puerto Rican man, he's got to be in a gang. Today, you see a Salvadoreño, a person from El Salvador, that person has to be in a gang. The gang is MS-13. Those associations are quick to be made, and they become part of a unconscious perception by most America that we are here to commit crime. And that feeds into law enforcement and criminal justice system's problems.
There have been that long narrative of Latino youth being engaged in gang activity, and gang activity in and of itself is oftentimes viewed as a criminal organization. But you can be a gang member but not necessarily being engaged in criminal activity.
We're not like everybody else, you know. That's what was different about us. That we're like the different ones, you know. They're like, look at them, you know, look at their hair.
Young people being loud, young people gathering in large numbers does not necessarily rise to the level of criminality.
The problem here is that the stereotype of a few or a handful that gets put upon an entire race of people.
Gang injunction is an extension of the prison system onto the streets.
What they do is that it gives permission to local law enforcement to go into this neighborhood that's already deemed problematic and has an injunction, so that there's like this annotation that it's dangerous, and they can come and question anybody in the neighborhood.
So people that say that it's not a big deal to have gang injunctions, it is a big deal when it's destroying families, when the whole community is seen as suspect, when there's 24/7 surveillance on the community.
Gang injunctions are like a blanket put on a neighborhood. Anybody in that community can be a target, and it's excused because they're suspected to be gang members. So it really gives law enforcement this excessive amount of power and excuse to violate somebody's constitutional rights. When my hometown, Santa Barbara, got hit with a gang injunction, we had to fight it through a legal avenue, through public opinion, through the media, and then through community organizing. So empowering the community to stand up and say, no, we don't need this. And after 4 years of fighting that injunction, amazing community members, families, and the legal team, that injunction was defeated. So it was won. It was won at the state level. By the time I was 12, I got into a fight at my middle school, and I was charged for assault. And I got on probation when I was 12 years old. I saw myself as a troubled person. I often ask, why can't I just follow the rules? Or why am I so angry? Within those years that I was on probation, I had a social worker assigned to my case at the age of 12. So she was very understanding and was so supportive of my family, not just me, but my mother. And I had a probation officer that was very invested in providing services to get me out of the system, not to keep me stuck in the system and this revolving door. And so I wanted to ensure that services that were provided to me, the support that was provided to me, that I was able to pay that forward to somebody else. Not just one-on-one, but also like looking at it in a systemic and policy frame.
It is not just simply that the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the entire world, but it's that African Americans, along with Latinos, now make up the population that is subject to mass incarceration.
The police enacted broken windows policing. They used stop and frisk. They increased their interactions with people, specifically communities of color.
The policy of stop, question, and frisk allows police officers to stop and search anyone acting suspiciously.
And the way stop and frisk was enforced was that they primarily focused on Black and Latino people.
Between 2004 and 2012, there were 4.43 million stops. 52% were Black suspects, 31% were Hispanic.
And so if the kid had a baggie in their pocket, which in their pocket is a $100 ticket, in the course of a stop and frisk arrest, once they pull out that marijuana and put it in plain view, that is an arrestable misdemeanor. And you have nearly 800,000 people that have been arrested for simple marijuana possession just in New York City in the last 20 years. You don't get to mass incarceration without there being a policy said or unsaid that includes racial profiling.
You could get these young officers who think my job is to just throw people in jail. They're a bad guy, they committed a crime, I throw them in jail. That's my part. Let the courts take care of the rest. Let the prison system figure it out. That's not my job as a cop, but it's much more complex than that.
If we want to break through issues of implicit bias in the police force, there's got to be a better way to think about relating to the community and protecting that community and engaging in legitimate law enforcement activities that does not perceive communities as being criminally prone and engaged in criminal conduct as a starting point.
You know, police officers go to certain neighborhoods and break up underage drinking and call parents, or they go to parties that have underage drinking and they arrest kids. So how do we work with law enforcement to do more of the former than the latter? And how do we make sure that the former is expanded to communities that look like you and me?
I really do think that you can change people's implicit biases that they're not even aware of through them interacting and collaborating with those communities. I think that's how people develop the cultural competency and put away those stereotypes that maybe they were brought up. But until you feel it here, you know, in the corazón, this is where the change is in the heart.
When I first got out into our communities back from Dominguez State Jail, I was just naive to what the real impact was going to be until I actually began going out there and looking for work, looking to see how I can make a living, how I can support my child who was 3 years old, Nicholas, you know, all these things. And I wasn't able to. I was struggling. I couldn't even get a Happy Meal at McDonald's, so you know that was a big problem for me, and so I was devastated.
To me, if somebody's done their time, we gotta forgive them on the back end. And if that's not the right thing to do, then we as a community, as a society, need to change our laws and say, well, we're not going to forgive you, and call it what it is, right? We're going to punish you, and we feel that it's punishment. And don't call it rehabilitation if it's not really that.
I'm a self-educated man. Ever since I was a child, even when I was homeless, my friends knew me as the professor. So, you know, learning data, I pretty much learned from YouTube University. All right, so they're there, and also going to the library and learning to how to data mine and do all kind of stuff. So I taught myself, but I needed to figure out, okay, what do I really want to do with this? And what is it really, how do I use this? So I played with it and played with it and played with it. And while I was playing with it, I didn't realize I was actually developing it.
In the United States criminal justice systems, it's very, very frequent for states to only report out how many people are arrested or imprisoned, on parole, or on probation. Only in black and white and other. They consistently count Latinos as whites. And until we finally fix this data problem, we can't have a full appreciation of how these systems actually hurt Latino populations.
We began collecting data, criminal justice history, voter information. We began data mining, and we figured out that we had almost 100,000 justice-impacted voters in San Antonio already. We also found out that about 57,000 to 63,000 were active voters. So we started breaking these down by ages, we started breaking it down by gender, in order to study the demographics of the voting patterns of justice-impacted people. Organizing criminal justice as a Latino isn't easy because our voice isn't as loud as others. Our historical struggles are not considered to be a part of the discussion. And a lot of times you put a lot of effort and energy showing up to these policy meetings and advocating and visiting people, and you feel like nothing's happening. One time, I was at the point where I was gonna just give up. But you want someone to be strong, and you want someone not to give up, and you want something to be a leader, then you have got to be those things too. And sometimes we get to the point where we're just like, enough's enough, I'm tired of it. But that's the test. That we don't give up. So I don't give up.
How do we change the culture of a punishment industry? We can't do it by ourselves as Latinas and Latinos, nor can the black community do it by itself. It needs the incredible solidarity among all groups that actually experience the magnitude of imprisonment in the United States.
I want people to understand that it's something systemic that we gotta fight against. We gotta abolish all prisons, especially when we know that that justice means just us, that we gotta change that.
We need to change, or we're gonna just continue making the same mistakes we've had in the past. We just gotta start listening to each other.
But we cannot allow this discussion to be limited in a way that completely erases decades of policies that were directed against Latinos because of who we are.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope that that film was just as impactful for you all as it was, I think, for us the first time we've watched it. I've watched it multiple times at this point. I feel like every time I'm learning something new. I'm hoping to turn it over to the panelists so we can get started on our conversation. If anybody has any comments, please also feel free to like put those in the chat too. But I really just wanted to just start, Carlos, like, why was this so important for you to make? Jorge, why was this so important for you to be a part of?
Well, for me, let me give a little background here, and that is that the people at Latino Justice had the vision to make this film. It was really Juan Cartagena and John Garcia at Latino Justice that felt that we wanted a place at the table for the Latinx community around this very important issue. And I really appreciate what everyone here is doing by bringing this film, because the title that I saw under this panel was Activating Justice Through a Latinx Lens. And that's precisely what this film is about. It's really about gaining visibility, creating dialogue, and creating a space for these issues to really be discussed and unlayered. This film is densely packed for a reason, because we're trying to cover about 150 years of history that has not really been exposed, particularly in this context or in this way. And so we wanted it to be the sort of cafeteria menu, so that people such as are assembled here on this panel can then take the various components or modules and discuss and break them apart, because it is a field that it is an area that really has not had the attention that it needs and requires. And I just want to add a personal note to this, which is as we were making the film, a constant point of conversation was, who's the audience for this film? And what the answer came up was our tias. That is our aunts, because I think so many of us, and I very much include myself in this, we are on either side of the criminal justice system. Some of us are justice impacted. Some of us, our family members are justice impacted. Some of us are police and law enforcement, and some are lawyers. We are this community of people. And for the tia who sits at the table listening to one niece who may have been incarcerated and a nephew who is in law enforcement, where does she come out on this? How do we help her gain more empathy and understanding? And that was sort of one of our driving motives in here. But as I said, this was a vision of the visionaries at Latino Justice, and in particular, John Garcia, que en paz descanse, is no longer with us. And this film is very much dedicated to him.
Yeah, Jorge, I am wondering about your perspective on the film as well, and why it's so important.
Yeah, first I was glad to be a part of it. I wasn't sure what my role was to be, other than just going through the system. Right now, the system affected me. I went through the system firmly believing that I deserved everything that was done to me because of what I had done to other people, because of harm that I had inflicted on others, right? And to get some of the consciousness, I think, that I didn't receive from books. I grew up with, Solo Trago la Tierra, reading Yo Soy Joaquin, Jose Angel Gutierrez, Regina, the folks in the Southwest, right? The La Raza Unida of the 70s, and the stuff that was arising out of that, right? But right after that, I was incarcerated for years, for decades, so I never really had a chance to get anything past that, because the Texas police system wouldn't allow any of that. So I had this long period where I wasn't exposed to a lot of what was going on. And then in a short period between sentences, I became exposed to Raul Salinas, I was a poet here in Austin, and he introduced me to a lot of the stuff that, of course, I never would have gotten even in Texas, the Puerto Rican revolutionaries and some of the other Latinx communities on the East Coast, right? That there are other struggles within our communities that are not just Chicano-based, that are not just Southwest-based, right? And I think this film does an excellent job of that, giving you a wide spectrum of some of the struggles that are going on across the country and across borders, right? I know that it is also captive of its time, and I would have wished maybe that there was more of the struggle or more of the complicitness of the government, right? Of president after president. We tend to look at Obama as this perfect figure, but there's a reason that but they call him the deporter in chief. There was a lot of other things that were going on there, right? That again, this film it was kept into its time, right? When it was made, I get that, and hopefully, you'll add that on down the road, Carlos, and we'll get a little bit about some of the president's involvement in this, because I think there is a lot to be said about the separation, the perceived separation between the movements, right? You hear of immigration, right? Like it's a confluence. Like there are movements that just kind of, ships of activists and movement makers just kind of colliding, right, in the night. And it's not, it is incarceration, it is caging for. I mean, don't get me started on evolution because I am an evolutionist, right? But I think that they're one movement, and I think that this is one way, hopefully, that by expanding the consciousness of those who watch this, right, that perhaps they can move toward that direction. So.
I'm really curious about, Jimmy, your perspective as also like being a former prosecutor and somebody who experienced, the control of the system from your own experiences. How do those tensions play out for you, and why what was it about this film that pulled you in, as a viewer and also as a Latinx attorney and former prosecutor?
There was a lot. The film covered so many different topics that you could make a series out of each 15-minute segment. So when I first saw it, I was about a year out, a recovering prosecutor, really trying to come to grips with how I felt about certain issues. I didn't like Trump. I had seen a lot of things that I hated inside the government. That's why I went to law enforcement accountability specifically to go after abuses of power that I'd experienced as a teenager in Virginia, and then as a prosecutor in Brooklyn. Complicity is a strong word for Jorge, and there is a lot of complicity, but I think there's also borderline gross negligence. And I think part of it is just the government and the machinery, just in order to survive as a parole officer, as a corrections officer, as a cop, as a prosecutor, as a judge, you have to kind of chip away at your own empathy and humanity, or else you can't really just do the job. So as I was trying to come to peace with all these different threads about the war on drugs and implicit bias and gang culture, and what do we do about why do we join gangs? Why do we break rules? It's because of this machismo, and without a father figure, you want to kind of assert your masculinity. A lot of us, myself included, we're survivors of childhood trauma, of childhood sexual abuse, and after that, you want to assert your masculinity in some way, shape, or form. And gangs are there, breaking laws there, carjacking, shoplifting, what you name it. But as a young person, you look for some kind of outlet. And so, as I was trying to piece together all these different thoughts I had, the title of the project, Decolonize Justice, kind of was the thing that kind of rooted me towards more abolitionist ideals. And I'm trying to navigate my way there humbly, taking it all in. But that's really the centralizing force to me, which was, where does this all come from? It's from capitalism and colonialist forces. That's why the war on drugs started. That's why you had to suppress certain voices. That's why there's racial divides. It all kind of comes back to that. And even just the way our mental health is kind of just neglected in all this. And that's one thing I think that sticks to me is the same dynamics I saw when I was a prosecutor. Well, when I was a juvenile, the people that ended up trying to recruit kids into MS-13 or Latin Kings, or some of my friends that never made it to high school, they were trying to prove themselves in a manly way. And that same dynamic applied to the cops who didn't want a defendant to resist in the street. Same thing applied to prosecutors. You didn't want to look soft on crime. You wanted to be the tough, go to trial all the time, gunslinger. And so that's still that insecurity we have specifically with men police officers, but it's not just them, but it's institutional. And again, it kind of ties into I think capitalism and the way we kind of just make everyone poor and ashamed of where they are. But yeah, no, there's so much to unpack, and every time I watch it, I come away with something new.
Can I just add something to what Jimmy said, because I think this is an incredible insight as he talks about that need to assert masculinity and the way that can affect our actions. And you speak about it in terms of the prosecutorial aspect of it. I was thinking of my own family members who were former gang members and are now Trump supporters. It's like, and there's a continuum. There's a continuum, I think, in that we have to understand and try to impact, because I think that there is something there. I had not heard that observation before, so I thank you for it. To me, that's a lot for me to kind of take in.
Yeah, I think it's tied to our own our impulse to punish instead of heal, or instead of embracing the person that hurt you. It's very case by case. You can't generalize, but our system from the beginning, based on Puritan roots, based on the founding fathers, all the way back when, was steeped in this notion that it's better to punish than to rehabilitate. And the idea of educating someone that committed a crime is still something that shocks the conscience to a lot of people. But that's interesting, the gang to the Trump supporter. And you see that connection. The same thing with, I've seen some cops be very chummy with certain corrections officers and very, very chummy with certain gang members, because there's that same dynamic there. How about you, Josh? I'm curious about you working on prosecutorial reform. What did you think of it?
Jimmy, I really appreciate that analogy, talking about toxic masculinity. Like, the queer feminist in me is like, yes, it's the toxicity of the system. And it kind of ties back to your point, which is, in order for all the cogs of the machine to work, everyone kind of had to give up their own sense of humanity and ability to empathize with others, in order to just do your job, handle your caseload, make your arrests. And that intersection is so interesting to me. And I think, at least in my work, it's so steeped in this tradition of capture and control. Within imperialism and how that ends up playing out in the data and our numbers, between Native folks being disproportionately incarcerated, in rates sometimes, depending on the area, and rates worse than Black folks. And I'm not saying that to say oppression Olympics. I'm saying that to say that there's a level of analysis that imperialism and the history of the United States, as it treats Latin America, how it's treated Native folks, has really shown up in the work that I've done, working in reforming and looking at the data that comes out of prosecutors' offices. So one of the questions I was going to ask you all was, what do you think is missing that you'd like to see built on more? You all mentioned that there's so many topics within this short documentary that, if you go to the Latino Justice website, there are other videos that will break down those topics further. And I really do encourage the audience members to go check those out. But I would say, even after watching those, I find myself wanting more and more information about the ways in which Latinx people are not counted data and crimmigration and things like that. But I wanted to see, is there something else that you're hoping that, is something that you really feel like is really important to build upon, that this film might have mentioned but didn't dive into as deeply as it definitely could?
I'd like to suggest something, and I don't know if it was necessarily a film, but I think about conversation. I think we keep talking about how we are criminalized, how certain groups are criminalized, and I want to suggest that no, that it's not just that; it's that we are seen worthy of being caged. A whole segment, I mean, there's a whole bunch of people out there who we say that all the time. Oh my God, that's criminal behavior. Are we envisioning in our head we want that person to be put in a cage? No, we say, oh, there's something wrong, and that there is something behaviorally deficient or whatever about the behavior that we are willing to say that's bad, right? But then we say that's criminal. But when we come to this conversation, we say we have been criminalized. I say no, we have been caged. Millions and millions and millions of us have been caged. We have been brutalized because we have been othered to an extreme that society has said that's okay to do that. It's okay to cage them, right? And I don't know, it's just something about the language. I think that we've been having discussions about who is a criminal, who isn't a criminal, right? In our abolition workshops. And inevitably, there are some individuals who are going to say, well, I wasn't a criminal because I just did this, and as y'all have seen with marijuana laws, right? What was in fact criminal behavior deemed worthy enough of a life sentence in a cage is now, now you can become an entrepreneur in it. So the line, attorneys, thank y'all, but the line is wrong. The line is shifts, okay? But I think that what we come to see as someone who, in fact, is a criminal is someone who commits harm to someone else, right? And I say that to say that we were seen as individuals, and we have been seen as individuals who are going to rape, like Trump said, are going to rape, are going to murder, are going to do this. We're not seen as individuals who are just going to go out and write checks, or who are going to be in finance and maybe do Ponzi schemes or whatever. Yeah, those people are criminals, yeah, but we're not going to worry about caging them. So that dichotomy, that the difference, let's look at the difference there and what is really happening, look at the reality that has really happened.
If I could just jump in here for a second. In light of that observation, I don't want to become partisan, but I do think there's a very interesting phenomena around who gets defined as criminal, and who's worthy of caging or not. And I just can't keep my mouth shut about this. When we look to see what is the illegalities that are going on in the name of the law when it comes to things like an insurrection against the Constitution, who is getting identified as a criminal there and who is not, and who is saying now there were nothing more than a bunch of law-abiding citizens out there on a picnic, walking like tourists to the Capitol grounds. And when I've heard that term law-abiding citizen having been used for the last 20 years in defense of the deportation of people, and I have felt as a lawyer, the law is the law, I must abide by it. I don't know how to push back on that argument. Well, those lines have been completely muddied now. And who is criminal, I think, needs to be looked at and reassessed, because there is criminality that is happening that is not being held accountable. And we, meanwhile, as you said, because we're perceived, Jorge, in certain lights, end up getting defined as criminal and getting that additional level of caging going on with that. And I think that hypocrisy and that line is really being unveiled now in ways that had not been before, particularly in light of the social justice system that has come out, movement that has come out of Black Lives Matter, and shown us how much is systemic. I mean, this is something that when we were making the film was not common conversation. We had to try to establish the systems that existed, unveiling those systems. Well, now that's much more common parlance. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of months has just ripped the veil off even more, as criminality in white suits has been displayed in front of us all.
I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of prosecutors and some cops too, they can admit, yeah, there's some bad apples. Yeah, the system's kind of biased or skewed. But the hypocrisies that came out after January 6th kind of put it on full display. It's not just skewed, it's white supremacy. Like, let's call it what it is. And if we're not able to at least name it and talk about it, then we're just gonna do little piecemeal reforms here and there. There's so many other things that are morally wrong that don't get criminalized, like wage theft and what landlords do. And you look at what is criminalized. I mean, it's very much, morality is kind of divorced from the law, and I think if more people had those situations where you had to bail your friend or family member out, if you had to pay $30 just to call your friend and or have them call you and check up on family members, once you kind of see what incarceration does, once you feel handcuffs, you're kind of way about the thinking about this changes. But unfortunately, we can't just wait for everyone to have a contact with the criminal justice system, and that's why films like this and discussions like this are so important, because I think more and more young people are getting more empathetic to it, which is giving me some hope.
I really appreciate it. Oh, go ahead, Jorge.
Just quickly. Yeah, I was gonna say, I was thinking about you asked about what's missing, and I think I would like to see more. And again, my God, it's such an incredible film, so much respect in there. What was it? 34 minutos? My God. Yeah, but bit more about the Puerto Rican diaspora, some stuff that was, I don't know about, right? The people coming out of the Dominican Republic, the connection. I was in prison when the Marielitos, right, came from Cuba, and yeah, because as a Latinx community, we don't have. I mean, we are constantly being refreshed, right? We constantly have, I viene el tío, I viene la abuela finally gets it up, and she's gonna come over, and we are bringing our culture, and we're bringing our traditions, and we're bringing, and a lot of us do speak different languages. I mean, it's not all Spanish. It's not at all Spanish, and I have learned that working at Latino Justice. There's a lot of dialect, and I think that as well, the history of the colonization of the Latinx people in the United States is almost because of our numerical superiority, right? Or because of the majority around the Chicano, around the Mexican American population, because there is that history, there is very likely a lost history of other individuals who again, we're American citizens. They are American citizens, but why are they treated second class? And I want to encourage Carlos, and I hope we can find you money so you can do a part 2 and a part 3, okay? Because I really want to see that.
So long as you are a part of it, Jorge. So long as you're a part of it.
Do an HBO docuseries. It would be incredible. I want to build on that piece that Jorge said about who deserves to be caged and take it to who needs to be controlled. Because I don't think that there's a fear of, the people engaged in white collar, crime, so to speak, for lack of better terms. I don't think there's as much of a worry about, the financial systems and who's defrauding, hundreds and thousands of Americans who probably had to work hard for their money. Like, those aren't the people that need to be controlled, because those are the people that are in power. So, I think about what I loved about this film was demonstrating the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy, and the ways in which the United States imperialistic foreign policy in Puerto Rico and in South American countries, Nicaragua, have led to, and were, we like to say that our community isn't united, but the system is united in how it treats us, right? That's not a coincidence that there's an American foreign policy that it's encouraging, trying to overthrow certain governments in other, Latin American countries, and now suddenly there's an increase in crack cocaine into poor Black communities, and now suddenly those bodies are filling up systems and costing lots of money, and now the 1994 crime bill needs to get passed, and et cetera, et cetera. So I that always is what gets to me. And I think the most also powerful in this film was the way in which it humanizes those who are being controlled, and showing, the ways in which these very real decisions are made very intentionally, I would argue, because they just work way too well together to be coincidence. To affect the Latinx community, that if we don't include our voices in the conversations about criminal justice reform and immigration reform, we're going to lose that connection in that way in which it's very intersectional in how they address us. I was wondering, Carlos, how intentional, I mean, I know it was intentional, but, you know, why that part was so important for you to really just draw out and connect for folks, because it is not a connection that people are making very clearly if you're not in our communities.
You know, thanks, Jeff, for pointing that out. My partner on this project was Paula Heredia, and you know, for her, and she's Central American. She's from El Salvador, so the connection was not at all something that was a stretch for us to get to and understand. It's there, it's natural, it's a linkage, but more deeply to your comment about control. That is what this film is about. Ultimately, was criminal justice as a form of social control, and the ways that various ways in which that is played out for our community through colonization, through stereotyping, you know, through over policing, through over incarceration. I mean, those are all. But what we wanted to get at, and that we includes Juan Cartagena, was what is a sort of underlying system for us? What is a defining point for us as Latinos? And in many ways, for many of us, that has been the issue of colonization, because so many of us who are part of this country historically, I'm being Mexican American from the Southwest, my father having been there since before the Mexican American War, on my mother's side being Puerto Rican, having been there at the time of the Spanish American War. You know, I really feel those impacts on both sides of my family. So in the way that Ava DuVernay really looked at from slavery to Jim Crow, you know, systems of control, we were trying to find a kind of defining a way to define that and organize it around that. So that controlling mechanism for us ended up being colonialization. I think it's legitimate. It may have been a stretch, but I do think that ultimately the point is, how does a system that is empowered control others? And I'm not sure I agree with you as to its intentionality. I think that they're not, in many ways, they're not smart enough to come up with it or devise it. I think that, and the United States is not unique in that, right? And in some ways, we're not as bad as most. But in fact, and so I think that recognizing that we're not special in that regard helps many Americans recognize that we're not necessarily pointing an accusatory finger at you, not solely an accusatory finger, but we are asking you to fess up to it and to be accountable for it and to recognize it. And you know, you're not necessarily unusually malevolent. You're just average benevolence, perhaps even better than average in terms of your benevolence. But through whatever means, there's been fallout. We are that fallout, and you need to recognize that. We ask you to recognize. We ask you to participate in that recognition. So I'm sorry to get off on that tangent, but I thank you for the observation around the systems of colonization and their impact on us, and particularly as a method of control. Thank you.
I do just want to just do a quick time check. We have a little bit more time for some closing remarks in case anyone wanted to respond to what Carlos had said, or if we want to jump into closing remarks, whatever folks are feeling.
I can jump in. This can be my closing remarks, because I think this ties into why HNBA is here. It's very important to realize that it's not just the U.S. who's done this. And a lot of times at these kind of functions where it's, you know, a lot of Latinx folk, Latino justice, bar associations, nonprofits, it's easy to say, all right, well, it's the U.S. who did all this wrong. But imperialism is not just a U.S. construct. Spain was part of it. And ese idioma que hablamos con orgullo is also a product of these very human-based instincts. And I think it's, like Carlos was saying, I think it's a little bit, I'm maybe in between Carlos and Jacques on, was it intentional, was it not intentional? I'm not sure. But I do know that it's definitely not just a U.S. product. And it's really important for us to look inward and say, well, even amongst us, you know, I'm white skinned, I'm benefiting from a lot of privileges here. And it's in standing between us and true solidarity, which is what I took away from the film this time. As we see, flyers with the Colombian flag and the flags from the Middle East, like it's a universal struggle, and I think we're finally getting to that point where we can say, okay, it's not just a U.S. thing, and maybe if we all kind of wake up and realize that this is something human, and we can overcome it if we overcome our baser instincts. Then maybe we get somewhere and really try to get to that true solidarity, because I think for a long time, Black voices, darker skinned voices are kept out of the debate, even amongst the Hispanic community and Hispanic legal circles.
I'll just say, and wrapping up, what Jimmy has pointed out there, I think it's deeply profound in terms of the universality of these shortcomings, and that the way and that universality is a lack of recognition of common humanity. And how do we get to that point? I'm wholly in agreement with that. I also, just as a random thought, I'm really grateful to HNBA for this screening. I'm also very grateful that I partnered with HNBA around another one of my films, A Class Apart, which was a historical documentary which looked at the Jim Crow-like conditions in the 1950s in Texas and throughout the Southwest. And I mention it now in part because there is a continuity of experience there. And going back to what Jack said about systems of control, that was a system of control that was obvious then. We're living in the legacy of that now, and it's incumbent upon us to make certain that we don't go through another phase of it. And that's what this conversation is about. I think, and I hope, and that's what this film is about, is to elevate that awareness so we don't fall into yet another regime of control. And thank you all for this opportunity to engage in the film, the dialogue.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Jimmy. I'm gonna turn it to you, Jorge.
Yeah, just a couple of things here. Within my lifetime, there have been countries in South America that have been at war with each other. And I say that to say that we struggle with identity. Who is Latinx, who is not Latinx, and what are the markers? There are German settlements in Mexico that, are they any more Latinx than, I don't know, than a person who was from Mexico and second generation in Germany? What's the marker? I don't know. And I propose that with us, it's something that I don't know if we look at as much as maybe as I would hope that we would, is el mestizo, la indígena. And I say that because I was, how enraged I was by Rick Santorum's comment about not being any culture in this country before they arrived, that the natives had no culture. The mestizo that runs within the indigenous people, I mean, the indigenous that runs in all of us at some point or another, I think, is our common touchstone. And I've heard people say, well, we don't really have a true Latinx in this country, and should we, and are we looking for one? And I don't know. I don't know. I think I've heard Maria, I think, out of California, talk about that sometimes we look too much to the future and we're not looking to the past for what it is that is going to unite us, right? Yeah, and I just want to say thank you all for being here today and inviting us today. And the people we're missing, again, the ones who I talked about earlier, I think, thank you for HNBA for inviting us to take part in this. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you, and thank you, Jorge, for those final comments. The idea of looking to our past instead of our future to see what unites us. I think that's really beautiful. So everyone, have a great day, and thanks for coming and being a part of this conversation.